Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to see you all here today. So today, as Christine said, we're going to be talking about accessibility. So first, I want to start with some big picture items. The first one is that accessibility is not a one size fits all sort of, you check your boxes and then you're done kind of situation. Things that make something more accessible for one person may make them less accessible for another. So it's really important to, look at it in a more holistic way. Another is that it's important to continue making improvements, even if what your digital content is not going to be perfect tomorrow. Every change you make to improve your accessibility is going to help someone, right? It's going to improve the experience for one of your patrons. So even if you can't get everything done all at once, incremental changes are still really valuable. Finally, there are a lot of folks, especially folks with invisible disabilities, who may not disclose that they have a disability. So oversharing and making as much of your accessibility information public as possible will actually help the largest number of people. So as you're thinking about communicating about your digital resources, that might be something really important to keep in mind. We are going to be talking primarily about digital and web content today, but I don't want to limit the conversation to that, because accessibility is actually something that you're probably working with regardless of what area of the library you're in. It applies to things like your PowerPoint presentations, any video content you're creating, the signage in your building, and also what you're spending your money on as a library. So while we're going to be focusing primarily on web stuff, I will be touching on some of these other topics as well throughout the presentation. For example, you may have noticed that the font in today's PowerPoint presentation is one that you haven't seen before. It's actually called Open Dyslexic, and it is an open source font that was designed to help people with dyslexia read more easily. So little incremental changes you can make. It's just an example. So in this session, we're going to talk about 6 common accessibility issues. You're going to have the opportunity to correct a problematic web page that I've created for you. And hopefully by the end of today, you will have chosen an improvement that you can make after today's session to make your library more accessible. As we talk about these different factors, there are a couple of things that I think are helpful to think about. The first one is, why are each of these things important? The second is, who do these barriers affect? And finally, what's I think incredibly important to us is, what can we do to fix it? So I'll be giving you all of those pieces today. So first, let's think a little bit about what are the holistic changes that you can look at to make your library more accessible. Especially with web content, the first thing that we want to talk about is the writing style. So this primarily affects people with learning differences, users who have lower reading levels, and also just about everyone. If your content is written well, this is a universal design issue. It will actually help to improve the experience for every user that comes to your website. So a couple of concrete things that you want to think about with your writing style. The first is that longer sentences are harder to read. They become increasingly convoluted and difficult to work with. So the tip is, limit your sentences to 15 to 20 words or less. You can count and see how long they are. You also want to make sure to change it up with some shorter sentences. So under 20 words, ideally, for some of the content in a paragraph to make it more readable for everyone. So also, this is something I think as people in the legal profession, we come up against in particular. Complicated terms are more difficult to understand. So if you have legal terms and terms of art, you really want to think about whether those are actually necessary in order to communicate your idea, right? So if there's an opportunity to use plain language, you want to try and do that. There are a bunch of really great suggestions for plain language, and I put the link in here to the broader document that explain what they are, but here were some of the ones that I thought were most important. First, less is more. You don't have to tell everything that you know necessarily on a particular web page. You really want to kind of consider your audience and think about what they actually need. You want to break up topics into smaller chunks so it's more digestible and easier for folks to understand. Whenever possible, you want to try to use lists as opposed to big, long, chunky paragraphs, right, which may be harder to read and keep track of. And finally, if you have acronyms or terms of art that you need to use, you really want to define those for folks so that they will be able to work with your material as effectively as possible. So we're going to go to our first exercise. We're going to be going into breakout rooms. I have 3 truly horrible sentences that I've put together for you, and I'd like you to take an opportunity as a group to take some of these plain writing principles and see if you can edit them into something more workable. So you're going to get separated into breakout rooms now. Please select the document that corresponds under exercise 1 to your breakout room number, and you can go right into the Google Doc and work together to get those sentences in shape. All right, wonderful. So even if you didn't get through all 3, hopefully you had an opportunity to play around a little bit and apply some of what we've been working on. I have they're not necessarily the best answer, but they're a possible answer for each of the 3. So for the first one, obviously, we're going to break that up so that there are not quite as many words. So you've got more than one sentence. And just to simplify a little bit. Now, for the second answer, I actually thought Group 7 did something really interesting. They added some bullet points to the question about dockets, which I thought was a great move. But here, a couple of things that were really important are you probably want to define what a docket is. You know, they may not be familiar with that term. Also, there are terms like adjudicated and rendered, which can really just be replaced with no decision. You don't necessarily need something overly complicated. And things like settlement and diversion may be extraneous information that you can just take out completely. And then finally, for the third one, again, we've dropped a bunch of more confusing terms. We didn't really need jurisprudence and circuit to get our point across. And we also removed some obvious information. So like the fact that you should do the research before your interview with a judge, they probably know that. It doesn't really need to be in there. Okay, so now we're going to get a little more in the weeds with some of the web-specific accessibility improvements that you can make. So first, when you're emphasizing text, you want to be really clear about how you're doing it. Some users, for example, people who are using assistive technology, may experience things like bold, italic, font colors, and highlighting differently than a sighted user who's coming and looking at the screen. So this affects primarily folks who are blind, low vision, but also, and this is an important one to remember, folks who are colorblind. Colorblindness affects a large portion of the population. And so it's really essential to make sure that you're thinking about the contrast when you're doing something like this. So for anyone who plays around with HTML, you may recognize the little carets, right? So the B's are bold, the I's would be italic, but this is actually not what you want to use because it's not necessarily going to be rendered the way that you expect if someone's using like a screen reader to read the text on the screen aloud. So instead, you want to use strong for bold and emphasis for italics. Also, if you're using color as your only indicator, for example, if you're highlighting like the word importance or you're changing the color of the word, right? That's not really something that you want to do. You want to try and avoid creating emphasis in that way. Now, for those of us who use LibGuides, which I know is quite a few folks in the library community, there's actually a really easy way around this where you don't need to know any HTML at all. So if you're using the rich text editor, all you want to do is make sure that you go in and you hit the bold or italic button rather than trying to kind of mess around with it yourself on the back end, and it will automatically create that strong and emphasis syntax for you, so you won't have to do it yourself. So next, images, right? If there is an image that's important on your screen and you have users coming to your site that can't see the images, you need to provide that content in some other meaningful way. So again, this is going to affect users who are blind and users who have low vision. So I actually wanted to change it up, let somebody else talk for a minute. At the Gwinnett Public Library, they actually did a great video on alt text that I'm going to play for you. It's like a minute. But the important takeaways are, first, you want to represent all important digital information conveyed by an image in writing. And you want to mark things that are decorative or that don't add meaning with a space or something else to indicate that, you know, a screen reader shouldn't read that content. Otherwise, it kind of clutters up the page for folks. So Christine is going to go ahead and play that video now.
Ever wonder how the visually impaired use visual platforms like Facebook and Instagram? Text-to-speech software reads aloud a thing called alt text. Alt text is a 1 to 2 sentence description of an image you can write when you post photos. Alt text should be accurate, concise, and contextual. Let's practice with these 2 images. Check out part 2 for how to get here. Alt text readers already say image of for pictures, so we won't lead with image of or picture of. The context of this photo is showing off my favorite kids book, so I was sure to include the title in the description. Alt text readers only read to 125 characters. Write longer descriptions in the caption of an image, not the alt text, so it doesn't cut off. And be sure to use complete sentences. This next photo features the same book, but I'm not going to state the title because I'm trying to share a more general joy of reading. Now that you know what alt text is, check out part 2 on how to add it.
Okay, there we go. But I think that provides hopefully a nice introduction to how you might want to write alt text when you're looking at an image. So another thing, we're bringing it back to PowerPoint here for a second. You want to include alt text also in your PowerPoints, and there's something that allows you to do that. So for example, remember I showed you this screen that had the 3 images about what the 3 things we're going to look at for each of these factors are. You're actually looking right now at the alt text for one of the images that I've put in this presentation. So for the little person selected in the bottom there, it's a cartoon of a person using American Sign Language sign for what? Right? Because that's what I wanted to convey with that image. So you can go ahead and do this for your PowerPoint presentations to make them more accessible to folks that might be interacting with them. Now, remember how I said some things are decorative, right? Personally, and you might disagree, I don't think that the little symbol on my holistic changes slide really adds anything substantively meaningful to the presentation. So here I've marked it as decorative using that little box in the bottom. So a screen reader would just skip right over it. Okay, so in addition to giving good names to images, we also want to give good names to links. Some users, you may even be one of them, use links to sort of skim a page and get a sense of what important information is in there. This is especially important to people who are using assistive technology because they may actually skim a list of links rather than going through and looking at the full text initially. So this affects primarily users who are blind or who have low vision. So what you want to do is you want to give short, unique, descriptive names to your links. So you don't want your links to be more than a sentence or less is really ideal. You don't want to give the same name to multiple links that lead to different places, right? Because that would be incredibly confusing for folks. And you want to avoid general names, things like that you may have seen like click here or link or read more. That's not going to be terribly helpful if somebody's looking at it without additional context. So here's an example of a section of my guide on New Zealand legal research. And you can kind of see I have a bunch of links that are in this little section on colonial legal history. And what I've done here in naming the links is I've given them, you can see unique names. And ideally, if you clicked on any of these, you'd have a pretty good idea, even if you didn't read the surrounding text, of where you're going to end up when you click on them. So that's ideally what you're going to do when you're creating link names. Okay, so I have created a bad website for you all. So what we're going to do for our next exercise is go in and fix it. The website is a fake website for the Digital Access to Legal Information Committee, which was sunsetted a while back. And you're going to be editing the page on the State Online Legal Information platform. The entire page that I've created for you is one giant infographic. The alt text is currently, why do you use solely infographic? So really not great. And you can, it doesn't have to stay an infographic. You can change it in any way you want. And you don't need to know any HTML. You can just click and drag and make it look like whatever you want. So we're going to break up into breakout rooms again. And you're going to use that same link, the exercise 2, and go to the link for your group number. And I'll be probably jumping around this time so I can answer any questions you have, because we're going to spend about 15 minutes working on this. Okay, so it looks like some folks are back. We're still waiting on the rest of the rooms to
tell us what solely means.
State Online Legal Information. It was an old project that the Digital Access to Legal Information Committee had been working on.
Thank you. It wasn't defined on our infographic and drove us nuts.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's see if we've got everybody back. Okay, so hopefully you all had an opportunity to take a look at something that maybe wasn't designed especially well and think a little bit about how you might redesign it or design it differently. We're not going to go over sort of like what it could look like because there's kind of an infinite number of options, but hopefully give you an opportunity to sort of think a little bit about it. We're actually going to move on next to talking about video. There are some pretty specific things that you want to make sure you have if you're working with videos. And the first one that almost everybody thinks about is closed captioning. So closed captioning is useful to people who are deaf and hard of hearing, people who speak English as a second language, and also users with auditory processing issues. So this is more than just for people who are deaf. So you really want to make sure you're creating a good transcript when you're creating a video. And if you're using some kind of automated service, like you upload your video to YouTube and let it automatically caption something, you definitely want to go in and check the automatic captions and make sure they're correct, especially with things like the names of Wessel and Lexus, for example, or things that may not be a term that it would recognize. You might get really weird results that are going to make your videos not necessarily make sense to people if you don't correct them manually. And there's a pretty easy tool for going in and correcting for most of these sort of automated captioning services. Now, something that folks don't think about as much is something called audio description. Now, what audio description does is it describes visual content on the screen to blind and low vision users, and it may also be used by folks who have visual processing issues. So this will likely mean, if you're making your own videos, that you're going to make an alternate version of the video. And you can do this by creating some time with just a black screen where you add additional narration for what's going to be on the screen. So many of you may not have ever seen audio description before in a video. So I actually have an example of what that looks like. So we're going to take a look at a teeny clip of a video with no audio description, and then a look at a video with the audio description.
The variety and functionality of legal research tools has evolved dramatically with developments in technology. We're beginning to see automated tools that can provide assistance at various points in your research process. These services can help you to check your research, locate new sources, and expand. They're most useful.
So that's the un-audio described clip that you have there. So next we're going to take a look at what it looks like with audio description.
Harvard Law Library. Automation as a fail-safe. LRW Spring.
The variety and functionality of legal research tools has evolved dramatically with developments in technology. We're beginning to see automated tools that can provide assistance at various points in your research process.
Why use automated services? Check your work. Expand your research. Have peace of mind.
These services can help you to check your research, locate new sources, and expand. They're most useful later in the research process to help give.
So you don't necessarily need a mechanical voice in order to be able to do something like this. For that one, it had been outsourced to a third party, so they had been providing that content, but you can do it just with your voice, the way that you would narrate any screen share video that you create. Okay, and the last thing that we want to look at for videos is flashing content. So this affects primarily folks who have seizures, but also people who are prone to migraines and folks who have head injuries or who have had head injuries in the past. So many of you have probably heard of this. It happened years ago, but there was an episode of Pokemon that actually became pretty well known for having this issue. There was a scene where there was this flashing content and it was flashing red and then not red, and it actually resulted in seizures for a number of kids. So this is something that you definitely want to think about because it may affect your patrons if you're creating videos. You never want more than 3 flashes a second. You want to try and avoid blinking objects on a page, and you want to be especially careful if you're using the color red. Finally, one thing that is not specifically our web development related, but that I think is really important to talk about and think about is collection development. We are licensing tons of digital products, and we don't necessarily have total control over how accessible they are. So it's really important to kind of think about that. And NELCO actually put out the preservation, discovery, and accessibility talking points that addressed pretty in-depth accessibility, thinking about accessibility when making these collection development decisions around digital content. So there were 3 big takeaways that I think are important to share from the accessibility portion of that report. The first is that when you're licensing things, it's important to know how accessible they are, right? When you're making decisions about what you do and don't want to spend your money on. And the information that you get from a sales team may not always be as helpful as you'd hope. It may be aimed at selling the product. So a third-party audit is a really good way, both for us to know how accessible the product is and for a vendor to know what they have to fix about their product. The second is that as we're doing these things, we want to make sure that our contracts provide for accessible products and have some reasonable amount of time for the vendor to cure any accessibility issues related to the product that we encounter as we're using that content. And finally, you're going to want a knowledgeable vendor contact at the vendor. So there should be hopefully somebody who you can call if you do run into an accessibility issue, who'll know how to answer your question or address your problem. Because oftentimes the time you find an accessibility issue or problem is when you have a patron sitting in front of you. And it's really helpful to have a knowledgeable contact when that moment comes. Okay, so we are just about done, but I have one more request, which is if you can go to the 3rd link down in that LibGuide and just do the quick 3-2-1 paper that's there. It will help you to remember anything that you took away from today. Hopefully, it will give me some feedback on your experience, and hopefully, just round out the day. And while you do that, because it's not a breakout room thing, it's just a go ahead and do it thing. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. And I think Christine is keeping an eye on the chat. So if you throw questions in the chat, I think that we'll catch them there as well.
So I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations for websites that you can maybe run through, like send a PowerPoint through for it to detect issues with accessibility?
That's interesting. So I haven't looked at it for PowerPoints. There are things called HTML validators that you can run a website through to get some indication of how accessible it is. The thing about the HTML validators is that you tend to get a lot of false positives for accessibility issues because it's just running it through a machine to try and get a sense of what issues might be, but yeah, sometimes it can be a little over-inclusive.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So if we wanted to do like an accessibility check for all of the resources that we make available on a library, around how long do you think that kind of project might take?
That's a great question. I'm not really sure. I think it may depend in part on how you're doing the testing, right? What specifically you're looking for. There is something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which kind of provides a framework for the industry standard for the internet, for what a website should have if you want it to be, as accessible as it possibly can be. If you're trying to get it into alignment with that, it may be a bit of a process. There are also third parties, as I mentioned, that will take a look at a website and give you a report and tell you where the problems are and give you some ideas on how you might fix it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Is this the right link for that WCAG? I'm going to just put it in the chat.
Oh, sure, yeah. There's also some really wonderful educational information on sort of learning more about accessibility through the WCAG organization. So if it's something that you're interested in, it's a great place to learn more.
Yeah.
For the font, that's the dyslexic font, is that something that like you need to download?
Yeah, so it's actually a an open source font. I'm trying to pull the link here so that if it's something that you're interested in, you can download it.
Definitely.
Yeah, one of the so there are a couple of things that make it particularly accessible, this font. One of the things you may have noticed is that the letters are heavier toward the bottom, which gives some helpful sort of top bottom orientation when you're reading. And the letters like B, D, P are not just the same image flipped in multiple directions. They're actually all unique characters. So those are some of the things that makes this a particularly accessible font for folks who have dyslexia.
I saw something about this like on Facebook and was like test reading it. And for me, I have ADHD. And so sometimes my like whole brain feels like it wanders. And this like keeps my attention more. And I've talked to other people that the same thing happens. So it's helpful for lots of people.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. All right, we're just about at time. Are there any other questions that I can answer?
There is one in the chat that I also am curious about. If NELCO or another organization has compiled a list of major law platform vendor and accessibility evaluations, or VPATs?
I'm not aware of one that's out there. I believe, is it the Big Ten? There's a I believe there was one university that was publishing them for a while. I don't know if that's still happening. But yeah, no, I'm not aware currently of a database of VPATs and accessibility information that is presently accessible. It would be really handy though.
Thank you for catching that in the chat, by the way. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to give a big kudos and shout out to AJ. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I know everyone here learned a lot and that it was a really informative and fun presentation on doing accessible design and all that it entails. And so, yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to email AJ or myself. And thank you all so much for joining us on another So You Wanna series. Yes, thank you, AJ, for putting your email in the chat. So yeah, thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.